Labą dieną. Pradėsime diskusiją. Aš pereisiu į anglų kalbą. Aš esu Nerija Putinaitė ir moderuosiu šią diskusiją skirtą nacionaliniai valstybei. Yes, and the question of the discussion is, will the nation state survive in the age of globalization? And we will touch very important topic, at least for Lithuania, but I think that also for other European countries. And the idea of the discussion was raised from Open Society, Open Lithuania Foundation, and this discussion is organized together with British Council and together with the Council of Nordic countries. I'll introduce shortly the idea of the discussion and the topic of the discussion, and what the globalization makes with the nation state, and what is the future of the nation state in the age of globalization. And will the nation state change the nature? Will it vanish? Or what will happen? What will happen with this structure of the democracy that is based on that is linked together with the nation state? There were historic epochs when the nation state did not exist, and even in Europe. And perhaps it is possible that in the future there will be no nation states in Europe. And also the history of the nation state is not very glorious. We know that during the years of the existence of nation states, they generated quite negative and destructive experience for the nations. State nationalism is blamed for the state politics of national exclusivity that led to humiliation, displacement, and even planned extinction of people of other nations. So does the actual transformation and does the actual change of the world will also change the status of nation state, and what will happen with the nation state? So this is a short presentation of a topic of our discussion, and I would like to introduce our dear discutants of this panel discussion. First of all, it is Szabolcs Pogoni. He's associate professor in the Nationalism Studies program at Central European University. And his research focuses on nation building, transborder minorities, and some questions of citizenship and so on. And he's now writing, as I know, a new book about extraterritorial ethnic politics. So it will be very interesting. Szabolcs has very interesting personal as well as professional experience from Hungary, and I think has very good and interesting ideas about the status and about the future of the nation state. The second panelist is William Outhwaite. He's professor of sociology at Newcastle University, and he's the author of numerous important books on social theory, and also he edited a book on social theory and post-communism, and that was very interesting also for our country. These insights are very interesting, and professor, he commented much, and he had his view on the Brexit, on the reasons of Brexit. So I think that it's quite another experience of what is nationalism and what is the nation state and what is the fate of the nation state in the era of globalization. And the third panelist is Lars Tradgaard. He's a writer and independent scholar. He's very famous in Sweden, as far as I know, because he wrote a book, Is the Swede Human? So together with his colleague, and this book is translated in Germany, but it's not translated in English till now, but I hope it will be translated. So, and Lars have very interesting experience because he lives part-time in United States and part-time in Sweden, and you will be able to correct me, but I think that, and he discusses very interesting comparative topics. For example, he compares the idea of civil society in United States and Sweden. And it's very interesting. It's also quite a different experience, and we now know that Swedish society accepts immigrants and have no fears of the fate of nation state, as far as I know, such fears as we have. So we have three panelists with quite different experiences, and I'll give the first question for the first insights for all of three panelists. Will the nation state survive in the age of globalization, and will it not survive? So, and perhaps before that, I'll ask the public, who thinks that the nation state will survive in the age of globalization? Please raise your hands. Okay, okay. Who thinks that the nation state will not survive in the age? Okay. I'm glad that you are not asleep. So I think it's quite our audience is divided. So I think that you will be persuaded at the end of the discussion that the nation state will survive in the age of globalization. So I'll ask. I'll repeat the question for our panelists. Will the nation state survive in the age of globalization? So please, perhaps I'll start from Sabolch. Could you take the microphone?
Okay, so can you hear me?
Just a little nearer.
Yeah, okay, so thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this great festival and also to this great panel with all the great panelists around. We were asked to be brief, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, and also I try to formulate my ideas more provocatively than I really believe in them. So as for globalization and nationalism in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s, there was a consensus, a strongly normative consensus among political theorists and leading mainstream left-wing liberal parties that nation states should soon be replaced by some sort of other style and system of governance. On the one hand, the consensus was that you will have strong centralization by this more centralized global new institutional system will be determined locally. So you have, probably you're familiar with this term globalization, so that is instead of the nation state you will have a higher level supranational government, and you will also have more power on the local level. Now, now it seems that this did not happen. And if one tries to answer this question, why this did not happen, why has the nation state been so resilient, surprisingly resilient in the age of globalization, the first thing that I would turn to is the history. And if you take a look at the emergence of nation states and the politicization of nationhood, what you will realize is that nation-stateness, nationhood, became important at the time and at the age of empires. That is, when you had a strong centralizing force, uneven development, the very different economic, social, and cultural development of the different regions that were incorporated in larger units, empires, became the source of political mobilization after the pooling of sovereignties. So I know that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. If you want to take an example from the history and try to think about globalization and the future of the nation state in light of the historical experience of empires, one could think, and this is my hypothesis, of course it's fortune telling, we don't know what will happen, but my guess would be that it is globalization that will strengthen the importance of mobilization along the nation state. That is, the nation state itself is reinvigorated by increased globalization.
Yes, thanks. I'm very pleased to be here at the heart of Europe and at the other extremity of the European Union from the one that I usually live in. I think Szabolcs has taken us right to the heart of these issues. I'd like to just briefly sketch the background. I mean, not everybody may realize that the term globalization is really by my standards, quite a recent one from the beginning of the 1990s. I was editing a dictionary at that time and suddenly realized with one of those, oh God moments, oh, we haven't got an entry on globalization, I must commission one immediately. The phenomenon, of course, has a much longer past. People talk about even the globalization in the Stone Age. I wouldn't go perhaps quite that far, but there have been other globalizations and there have been other periods of more nationalist reaction. So I think, I take the view that globalization is real, the nation state is also real, and I see two sorts of, crudely, trajectories for nation states under conditions of globalization. One is to go in for the kind of integration process that Szabolcs was talking about and that we've seen in the European Union, the pooling of sovereignty, and in a way that doesn't in important ways diminish the sovereignty of national states, but actually makes it possible for them to do things that they couldn't do individually. The alternative route is a kind of nationalist defensive reaction for which Brexit is one example, Trump's election and policies are another. Nation states that want to do that and to take that route have important resources. They can close their borders. The German Democratic Republic closed its border reasonably successfully, though in an inhumane way. They can introduce localized policies with regard to culture. They can play on an idea of a national culture and differentiate themselves quite artificially from other parts of the region. So the future of the nation state, I think, is a relatively optimistic future where they will increasingly form together in larger organizations, whether it's the European Union or similar types of, at the extreme, federal structures, or a kind of so-called not-so-glorious isolation, cultivating national peculiarities, national fantasies. I mean, the fantasies around Brexit, I think, are particularly revealing at the moment. And which way nation states will go is a very open question.
Okay, thank you. And Lars?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's delightful to be here. Yes, now, of course, this question that you are posing is and has been now for quite a few years, and certainly the last 2 years, the big question. And I think myself lived in the UK leading up to the Brexit vote, and then I moved from there and I experienced the presidential elections in the United States. And clearly, you know, we are living in a moment where this great tension between the so-called globalists versus nationalists, right, is in some ways defining, right, you know, the political discussion very broadly, I think, you know, and it's nothing peculiar to one country or another. Now, from my point of view, you know, being a Nordic, you know, coming from Sweden, it's very interesting to watch the unfolding of the debate there, because the Nordic countries, and perhaps particularly Sweden, are deeply invested, I would say, both, right, in the project of national democracy. I'll get back to that shortly. But they're also deeply invested in international solidarity, right? So human rights, on the one hand, and citizenship on the other, were for a long time thought of as being virtually synonymous. You know, you do good things, work for social justice at home, and then you sort of do the same thing on a global level. Now, it turns out now, and this was very clear in 2015 during the refugee crisis, that actually, you know, the idea of citizenship and the idea of human rights are in very profound tension with one another. Citizenship tied to the nation state depends on boundaries, right? Social contracts, you pay taxes, you earn rights. It's very clear, in some sense, very straightforward. Whereas human rights and this kind of more globalist vision of solidarity operates from ideas of no borders, of intrinsic human values that bind us all together. And it tends to be juridified in international conventions and divorced, right, from democratic politics and budgets, right? And I think this is the unresolved dilemma we're in. And the European Union itself is a good example of this, right? This is a, you know, it's an instruction sort of halfway, right, between federalism and some sort of intergovernmental cooperation. And the question is, totally unresolved in my view, is can you really scale up, right, democracy and the politics of solidarity, you know, from the nation state up? A lot of people sort of say yes, but there's very little evidence that this is actually possible. As far as I know, there is no democracy outside of the nation state, right? There is no such thing as a welfare state that is disassociated from the nation state. So it's very unclear to me, right, how you're going to make that maneuver, right? The European Union is perhaps primarily identified with a democratic deficit. You know, Brexit is not just, you know, a question of sort of evil nationalists, you know, who have sort of fantasies about England. It's also legitimate concerns, right, about the lack of a social contract and the politics of fairness. And I think those questions that people who are really aiming for a post-national world order, they need to grapple with those challenges for real. And I don't see it happening. Doesn't mean that I'm optimistic about the future of the nation state. We could also move into a post-democratic world, right? We're living in a sort of a global market society where nobody really, you know, has any democratic influence over anything. You know, that is also a distinct possibility. And, you know, we will live to see, but these are crucial questions I think we all need to debate as citizens of our respective countries and as, you know, members of some form of global community.
Okay, thank you very much. So it was quite a large spectrum of ideas we've heard now, because one of the idea was that the strengthening or expression of the nation state strengthens in the face of globalization as a reaction to the globalization. The next is that we should look perhaps also for some forms of federalization, but we can't find that could satisfy the nation state. And also, I think the last idea about the solidarity, and it is possible to have solidarity and democracy outside of the nation state. And And it is quite a crucial idea that doesn't lead us to the answering of the question about the future, but we can try to answer the question, what is the nation state, and how could we define the nation state? Because it was also some suggestions that it's a kind of place of solidarity. It's a kind of expression of solidarity, and it's expression of democracy. Or even some kind of historical and cultural and social expression of historical formed cultural and social community. And so could you reflect or react to the ideas of your colleagues, and could you propose some kind of not definition but ideas, what is the most important for the nation state? What is the most important for the nation state in the future, and why the nation state is so precious for us and for the societies who live in the nation state? Okay.
Can I, yes, just 2 points really. One, I prefer to talk about the national state rather than the nation state, because I happen to live, like many Europeans and other people in the world, in a state which is made up of a multiple of nations. If you say how many nations are there in the UK, people often say 5, if they think about it seriously. England, much the biggest, Wales, Scotland, the north of Ireland, and then maybe the UK as a 5th semi-nation, made up a kind of nation of nations, like a set of sets. And so if you say, where is the focus of democracy, and this is coming to my second point, for many people in those subordinate nations or component nations of the UK or of Spain or whatever other example you want to take, they may identify as much with Scotland, with Catalonia, as with the larger political entity. So the national state and the nation state may at that point diverge. The second thing I'd like to say, if I can, is just I'm a bit more naive and optimistic than Lars about democracy on a larger scale, partly for those reasons, that it seems to me perfectly possible to have a functioning Scottish Parliament, UK Parliament and European Parliament, and for citizens to divide their attention between those respective parliamentary bodies and those respective political entities. As Lars pointed out, this hasn't really happened. Wolfgang Streeck talks rather nastily, but with some reason, about the so-called European Parliament. I mean, the European Parliament has never really been taken seriously as a parliamentary body by voters and to some extent by the European Union's political system. And, you know, a colleague of mine became a member of the European Parliament, and I used to tease him about its pathetic weakness. And he said, "Oh, wait a bit, William, you know, parliaments are always like this. They gradually get more power as time goes on. You know, give us 10 years, 20 years, we'll be okay." And that doesn't seem to be happening. The welfare state, again, there is no reason why one can't, I think, organize a welfare state on a transnational model. And like many people, I would love to have the Swedish welfare state in all its glory extended across other parts of Europe. The European communities and then the European Union, for quite good reasons, chickened out of setting up a serious attempt to act in relation to all the complexities of welfare legislation. And you can see why they didn't want to. On the other hand, the kind of, again, rather vacuous talk about a European social model doesn't mean very much for European citizens. But I think, again, it's possible to conceive of ways in which European social policy which it presently exists in a sort of indirect form in the common agricultural policy, could be extended and could become a reality.
Okay, so in Hungary we have nation state, not national state, or I deliberately used nation state because we use in Lithuania as a nation state, yes, and I think that in most of East European countries we use the term nation state by meaning that is kind of so nationally at least a little homogeneous, or one nation dominates other nations in the state. So I think that perhaps from your perspective is how could you define this nation or national state? I don't know now.
I think it's, this is a semantic question, so I'm happy with both terms. I don't have an issue with any of those. In terms of Hungary, okay, so I consider the nation state, or I use this term, but I have no objections to the national state. I would call the nation state as an institutionalized solidarity in which the population is defined not only by this common institutions that regulate solidarity, intergenerational solidarity, but also you have cultural, linguistic, and other boundaries that are reproduced in order to maintain this closure that distinguishes citizens who are part of this institutional arrangement of solidarity and non-citizens. So by definition, the nation state is about social closure. You have citizens and non-citizens. The reason that I like this definition is that it puts institutionalized solidarity rather than any cultural putative homogeneity into. So that's the core of nation states on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also a neutral statement. So that is, usually people start to wonder about nationalism as the first question, whether nationalism is good or bad. In this definition, nationalism can be both. The Swedish nation state is often used as an example of an egalitarian welfare state, nation state as well, and you have a host of other bad examples, which brings me to Hungary, which is a nation state in the strongest possible sense of the word. It's legally a nation state. According to the new constitution passed by the Fidesz government in 2010, Hungary is a state for the Hungarian nation. It acknowledges that we have different nationalities living with us, and they are entitled for the same rights than members of the Hungarian nations, but the Hungarian state is symbolically owned by the Hungarian cultural nation. And by Hungarians, we don't only, the constitution means not only Hungarians, cultural Hungarians who live within the boundaries of Hungary, but also Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians living outside the Hungary. So if you take seriously the language of this new nationalistic constitution, Hungary is a political unit which is designed to reproduce and serve the interests of ethnic Hungarians who may live in or outside the country, and we also take care of the equal rights of other nationalities or nations, or members of other nations and nationalities who live with us, but they cannot make a claim on the Hungarian state, a similar claim than Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians can.
Is Sweden a national state or a nation state? Because you mentioned the solidarity that is necessary for the country. So how do you define? Because as far as we know, it's very open to huge number of nations to come.
Yeah, this is true, and I think the key here, right, is that the organizing principle for the Swedish social contract is not the nation, right? We wouldn't have formulation like that. It is a citizen, right? So you know, when in the 1930s, Social Democrats sort of had a slogan that they called the people's home. People forget that the famous speech that this Prime Minister made in 1938, you know, or 28, had a comma after people's home, and it was the home of the citizens, right? And so it's a contract between state and individual, right? That is the primary thing, which means, of course, it's open, you know, to, you know, individuals that may have a different ethnic background, right? And I think this emphasis on state, you know, is very important. I think a lot of people talk about the nation state, they get lost in talking about the nation, right? From a Nordic perspective, it's the state. The Nordic countries are very unique in that you have a trusting view of the state, which is crazy from the point of view of most people in the world, right, that have very good reasons to be suspicious, right, of concentration of power in a state, right? So it's a very high trust societies like the Nordic countries that are very few in the world, right? They have this particular possibility, right, of forming a social contract between states and citizens. And I think this is where citizenship really becomes the key idea. You ask yourself, what is the hallmark of a high trust society? It's an acceptance of high taxes, right? You know, you have these societies with the highest tax rates in the world and no anti-tax political parties or movements. The reason is because there's a legitimacy involved, right? So trust, taxes, citizenship, and the state, you know, are the central components. And I think that it is also true that we've talked about that there is also a sense of a shared culture. But let's not forget, culture, right, for an anthropologist is more than values. It's also institutions, right? So, you know, when we're talking about a shared culture, we're also talking about shared institutions. This is why I agree so much with you. You know, the idea, right, there's an institutionalized form of solidarity, right? And so what we believe in are these shared institutions. High trust societies also tend to be low in corruption, right? These are the keys. And this is how we have to understand it. So usually what you know, to play with words again, right? When I talk about Sweden, I used to say what is characteristic is a form of nation-statism, right? Not nationalism, nation-statism or civic statism, right? An idea of an adherence and a loyalty, you know, to the state. But that is hugely important in all of these discussions of the nation-state, because the legitimacy of the state as, right, a locus for a social contract. If you're going to replace that or scale it up, you know, you have to also scale up trust. You have to scale up taxes. You have to scale up confidence in institutions. And this is all I'm saying here is as an empirical fact. I can agree with your longing, but as an empirical fact, right? The European Union has not managed this. I'm an historian, so I tend to look at what has actually happened rather than project the future. And I say, if we're going to learn from the past, the European Union really has a lot of homework to do in this regard. We need to stop, like, you know, being mad with the English and still try to understand why Brexit occurred and why there is doubts about the European Union, you know, and then move forward.
Okay, so we have quite different, I would not say definitions, but understandings of the nation state, this national state or nation state, or the state where the citizenship is important. But anyway, I think in all of these in all of these interpretations or understandings from different cultural and from different cultural contexts, we see that the nation state is linked to kind of solidarity, trust, community. And in one case, as well in Hungary, as well in Lithuania, I think this sense of community is linked to the culturally and historically formed nation, more than in Sweden, where this trust and solidarity and community is linked to the citizenship, to the respect for the state. And I think that in Great Britain is also perhaps the community is linked and the trust is much more linked to this different national communities that live in Great Britain. Or anyway, as far as we came with this discussion is that what is important in the age of globalization for the nation state, that it's a kind of place of solidarity that is necessary for the community to live, that is necessary for rules to work, that is necessary for the institutions to function. So, and we see that it's perhaps it's very important also for the nation state in this sense is very important also for functioning of democracy, because when we look at the possibility of some outer spaces out of the nation state, we can't see the possibilities of democracy to function properly. You mentioned already the European Parliament. It doesn't function properly as a kind of democratic institution. I think it was the idea. So perhaps the last question to get to the audience and to ask for your questions is. I would like to ask about the democracy, about the nation state and democracy, because as you see in Hungary and some other post-communist, I would say post-socialist or post-communist countries, the nation somehow it goes into contraposition to the democracy, or it's just popular interpretation. And what is the relation between nation state and democracy? And is it possible to have some democratic institutions? Perhaps it's possible if we would like to, or if we will create a kind of federal state or imperium or something like that, that would function and would unite several national states, or I don't know what could look the future of globalization and the future of global solidarities. But is it possible to create something like that would have the solidarity and would function properly as a democratic state or democratic federal state or democratic imperium? I don't know. So please tell me.
Okay. I'm a philosopher by training, so I'm very I can imagine many things. Philosophers can, so I have no problem with creative ideas, but realistically I don't see any signs that the European Union would soon become anything like a nation, a federal state or a nation state. And the reason for this is very simple. I mean, this is the empirical evidence that Lars also mentioned. You need solidarity. That is, at the moment when Swedish or German pensioners will be willing to share their healthcare system and pension savings with pensioners in Bulgaria, we're there. But I don't think it's happening. And also democratically, I mean, a lot depends on what you mean by democracy. In the Hungarian government can be considered as they claim to defend democracy, but they have a populist democratic vision, and they openly contrast it, and rightly so, with another conception of democracy that is liberal democracy. And they consider liberal democracy as a target, but they're not targeting democracy as such. Liberal Democrats, including myself, would say that, okay, but the populist democracy that you're promoting is a contradiction, because it violates the basic principles of individual equality. And although you claim that this is democracy, this is not democracy. So again, whether you can have a democratic nation state or anything democratic beyond the nation state is to a large extent a question of what you mean by democracy. This is an essentially contested concept. So those people who are the Hungarian government is often criticized, they claim that eventually we are the real Democrats.
Right.
But what concerns the solidarity, you see, a lot of things were built and invested in Lithuania, Hungary, and other East European countries. And these investments came from the taxes of people from countries like Sweden, Great Britain, and so on. So I think it was a sign of solidarity. And what you say about pensions, so it's not quite true. Yeah?
Just one sentence. I don't want to hijack this debate, but the Hungarian government, which I'm a harsh critique of, will say, okay, yes, we got some funds, some cohesion funds, but that was part of a deal. It's a business deal. So in return of the cohesion funds, we opened up our markets and made it possible for the companies of better developed countries to come to Hungary. We basically abandoned all the taxes, extra taxes levied on foreign companies. So that's a deal. That's what they say.
Right.
So, okay, so...
I mean, if I may jump in now, I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead of you, but I think this is an important discussion. And I think, first of all, I so agree with you. There are different modes of democracy, right? You take a country like Sweden, or perhaps even Hungary, it's a form of like substantive democracy, where you know, it involves actually a fair amount of money and exchanges, whereas sometimes you have visions of a more procedural republic, like along liberal lines, which is maybe not as focused, right, you know, on things like taxes and social rights. You know, so this, I think, you know, is important to remember in this context. The other thing is that when you're looking at a democracy of the Nordic type, you have to understand one thing, that the American word welfare connotes getting something for nothing, right? Welfare queens and things of this sort. This is not the way it works in the Nordic countries. You know, it's a very tough moral behind here. You know, you gotta work to earn your rights. You know, there are no free lunches in Sweden. I'm sorry. You know, and that means, of course, that if you're going to extend it, the Bulgarian example, right? You know, Swedes will react to, why should people come here and not first pay into the system? You know, you may say that's small-minded, you know, mean-spirited, stingy even, but, you know, it's not completely unreasonable, right? And so therefore, you know, if you're going to scale up, you know, you're going to have to scale up the sense of duties, not just rights. And unfortunately, you know, you see this in the human rights discourse as well. You know, the idea somehow is we're all rights bearers, but there's only a couple of us that are duties bearers. That is not going to work if we're going to build a society. We're going to share that, we're all going to give, and we're all going to take. And so if you're going to scale up, you're going to have to deal with that question as well, right? It's not a project of charity, right? It's a project of taxes and then social rights.
Yeah, very pragmatic view. So, so please, with your ideas.
Yes, I mean, I think if we're talking about European solidarity, we should probably be thinking about NATO as well as about the European Union. And, you know, if my question, in a sense, to the Brexiteers in Britain is, you know, if you're willing at the limit to start the Third World War in defense of Lithuania, why are you fussing about some people from Lithuania picking vegetables in eastern England? There's a kind of contradiction, I think, between a military political solidarity and a rejection of other forms of solidarity and no feeling of commonality with other citizens of the European Union, which of course we are. As citizens of Hungary, Sweden, the UK, for the time being, we are European citizens. Again, the European citizenship was a kind of paper entity which nobody took seriously, but again, it could be something more.
Okay, so we, I think that we came to the anyway, we came to the necessity of the nation state, but from the other side, because we realized now, after this discussion, that there are different understandings of solidarity in the nation states or national state or welfare states. there are different understanding of nation state, there are different connections between the citizen and the state in the different nation states. And we see the huge differences also in Europe. So it would be very difficult to discuss, I think, to create a kind of common democratic functioning of a kind of supranational federation or something like that, because we see that the understanding of democracy is quite different in different states. So I think that it is a kind of proof or statement or proof for the necessity of the nation state that guarantees the solidarity between the people, that guarantees a kind of also identity of people, I think. We didn't talk about that much, but I think that it could be very important also to speak about the identity that is linked with the nation state, and that is important for the personal identity, and sometimes it's much more important than a political structure, this identity, state's identity. But anyway, I would like to proceed to the questions, and perhaps somebody would like to ask or to react somehow in this to this discussion. So somebody, Algis.
Thank you. Algis from Vilnius Institute here. Well, actually, reacting to what Lars said about scaling up of duties as well, you know, and Nordic model or being it able, when we think about it, is it can we scale it up to the rest of the Europe, for example? So let me give you a particular example of one of the sponsors of this event, Swedbank, no, and other Scandinavian banks that operate here and really capitalize, really provide investment for the Baltic economies here. I mean, one of the associations of bank client rights here conducted a research and discovered that we pay 5 or 7 times more in comparison to Swedish or Danish or Finnish bank clients, according to our salaries and so on. So it seems that we pay here in Eastern Europe. We are sharing duties 5 or 7 times even, you know. So the scaling up of duties is enormous, really. And you know, then not sharing of welfare regimes is a lack of political will, lack of discourse, universalist discourse. The universalist, the human rights-based discourse is weakened in the first place. And it's a discursive problem. To say that nation state is holy and fantastic and like in Hungarian case is really lack of strong pro-universalist, pro-European discourse in the, I don't know, on the many levels in Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. I think you know, I think you're pointing to, in a way, these sorts of processes that are occurring not on the political level, but in a way, you know, day to day. And I think there is a little tragedy in some sense, right? That what has been the real strength of the European Union, right, has been its economic dimension, right? Like what it used to be. Remember, it was free trade, right? And you know, truck and barter and commerce are probably the best instruments, right, for creating links between people, right? And I actually very rarely hear anybody in Sweden, you know, say anything particularly unfriendly about the Baltic countries, because I think they already feel, right, that we are in this engagement, you know, that, you know, has everything to do with truck and barter, right? Or duties and rights at the next level. Now, where I agree with you, we haven't really carried out that discussion yet. But you see, there I'm very hopeful, right? Because what we did in the other Nordic countries years ago, we started to open up, you know, customs unions, and we started to ease up on things and cooperate in different levels. However, you remember, we always stayed away from creating one Nordic state, right? You know, you try to tell a Dane that let's form a united Nordic country under Swedish leadership, right? And they will have you arrested immediately upon next visit in Copenhagen, right? So the question is like exactly what form will it take? But I think that cooperation in the Baltic, right, based, right, on these commercial relations, and a growing, slow growth of a sense of commonality, right? That I very much believe in. And then if we can take it up a couple of notches and think about common health policies and, you know, insurance systems and so forth, so all the better. I'm totally with you on that.
Okay. Okay. So somebody else? Okay, Tadas. And after you afterwards, yeah.
Tadas Langaitis, MP in Lithuania. So we all seem to agree that globalization is inevitable, right? And we're moving towards a global community of sorts. Which countries or regions or unions, which institutions or organizations today are setting the pace, are like ahead in the process to your knowledge or to your thinking? Thank you.
William, perhaps you?
Well, I think the answer my answer has to be the European Union in the first instance, offering a model which, in terms of integration, in some ways goes even further than the United States in terms of the recognition of qualifications from one state to another, and so forth. And I think that's a model which has attracted interest in the rest of the world. In relation to globalization, of course, I mean, you can see entities like the European Union partly as an engine of globalization, an amplifying entity, but also as a form of defense against globalization, against the intrusion of practices and products and so forth, which you don't want to accept. I mean, the British are currently worried about chlorinated chicken from America as an example, but I mean, again, European Union attitudes to safety of food and so forth are an example of the kind of resistance that you can put up as a large entity, and a small national state can't really do that.
Yeah, just one sentence. It is the European Union that is usually being cited as the example what could be done in terms of integration, and the European Union has been extremely successful in its primary aim, that is just security. There's been no war in Europe. That's a great and huge achievement. But if you think about, I mean, just like anything beyond that, the European Union encountered its two biggest crises recently, the economic crisis and the migration crisis. And unfortunately, the European Union has been very ineffective in addressing any of these. So I think if this is the best example, the best practice we can have, there's still a lot to do. And I'm someone who would be very much in favor of anything beyond the nation state, but realistically, I don't see that. You know, it's so far. It doesn't seem to be realistic at this stage. I would be very happy with it, personally.
I think...
Could I just add one small little comment there? Because I think that, you know, I'm not so sure if I would just agree to the idea that, you know, globalization is sort of just marching on. Because I think that if you look, you know, more closely, I say what is really happening is a mismatch, right, between economic globalization, right, and a lack of globalization at the political level, right? You know, and so that's the first point. The second point is that if you look at some of the real winners in the sense of economic globalization, ironically enough, right, some of the greatest winners right now are the Nordic states, right? By all measures, right? They're doing incredibly well. But they are also the strongest nation states, you know, or states, I should really say, right? You know, keeping with what I said earlier. Now, how do we explain that? Because they are investment states. They spend money to invest, right, in infrastructure and in individual citizens to prepare them to be successful in a very competitive global market society. There is nobody in the Nordic countries against free trade, right? The kind of arguments you would have in big countries. You know, so you have to remember that nation states are not in opposition to economic globalization. Success in globalization requires, in my mind, strong states, from the point of view of citizens in particular, but also from point of view the infrastructure in general.
Okay, we will. I think that our discussion showed one thing, that there is impossible to create a kind of supranational political unit without efforts showed by the nation states. And I think that usually fears that are given or expressed that the globalization will somehow extinct or weaken the nation states. It's much more fears that don't look at the situation that to create the European Union, nation states needed to give huge efforts to do that. So any supranational political unit, it is an expression of the huge efforts of nation states and huge political decisions. So the natural processes perhaps there are in economic level, but in political level, these processes are based on the decisions of the nation states. So I think that there is not so many grounds for the fear of the fate of the nation state. But anyway, it's just a reflection. And just the lady wanted to ask the question.
Hello. So in the 21st century, we are able to see the increasement of nationalism all around the world. And how would you explain this tendency? Do you think it's the society's approach to revolt against the increasing globalization? Or is it and the possible threat of losing their superior claim to the nation states? How do you explain the increasing of nationalism? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I can start, but I mean, I think that, you know, we have had a lot of discussions about in a sense, the gap, right, between elites and peoples, right? And I think historians, right, in 20 years from now, are going to write articles about the following. They're going to ask this simple question: how on earth, right, did so many people lose sight of the importance of citizenship at this era that we live in right now, you know? And I think it's going to be a very important question, because a lot of people who were belonging to these elites, right, you know, did live in a sort of a fairyland of post-national fantasies, and they underestimated, I think, right, the importance of democracy, of the nation states, which is the only locus for that. And that, you know, has come to bite them in the ass now, right, to a very great extent. And that goes on in a lot of countries. And I think now the big question, right, for these very elites is whether they're going to see this not just as expressions of racism and stupidity, right, which is what, unfortunately, you hear a lot, but instead understand that there is a democratic deficit, and perhaps they themselves are part of the problem, right, and not just morally superior. So, you know, I have a lot more sympathy, actually, right, for these, you know, so-called populist, nationalist, you know, reactions than perhaps many do. I think we have to take it serious. We have to start to listen with some degree of respect to why people are pissed off, right, before we judge them too harshly.
I mean, as I said, it's basically globalization that creates nationalism. That's the way that I see it. We have theories about this. It's an old theory, uneven development. So that is one way to mobilize in the peripheries the populations is through nationalist mobilization. Its roots are economic, but the style and strategy of mobilization is nationalism. Thomas Nairn and all these other theories dealt with. What is interesting is that now you have a mobilization, nationalist mobilization against integration, even in the core countries. That is, people in the more developed countries in the European Union are also becoming increasingly skeptical of anything beyond the nation state, which is, I think it's a novel phenomenon.
Yes, I mean, perhaps just the obvious point that, I mean, nationalism has a kind of dynamic which moves naturally towards proliferation, and that for almost any political entity you can find sections which might want to secede and to become independent, and to defend that independence often in national terms, if there's some kind of national symbol that they can attach themselves to, whether it's, for example, the Welsh language in the UK or whatever. So there is that sort of balkanizing impetus, I think, built into nationalism, but it doesn't always happen. So the Soviet Union, when it broke up, there were fears that it would break up into, you know, thousands of pieces rather than just the pieces that it did break up into. That St. Petersburg would secede from Russia, that even bits of St. Petersburg didn't really want to be linked to other bits of St. Petersburg, and so forth. So that kind of dynamic is something which I think a lot of states confront.
Okay, so some more questions. Who just, I don't know, the lady, yes. You, yeah.
So hello. According to some of you, federalization is definitely not a way for European Union to go. So my question is, which scenario from a white book proposed by Jenka do you support? Is it a Europe of different speeds, coming back to the idea of just economic union, or we just continue what we are doing with European Union? Thank you.
Cards on the table. Well, I think it's a great question. It's an honest question. It's a direct question, and it's a difficult one. We were talking about it actually in the car coming here yesterday from Vilnius, and we were chatting about the different alternatives facing Europe, right? And I think you touched on them very nicely. You know, one obviously, right, would be some sort of deepening, right? You know, trying to aim for this European nation state, right? And I'm not very optimistic about that, but you know, it's a thought, right? It's an idea. The second one, you know, would be to retreat, right? To what actually has worked pretty well. You know, some form of economic free trade area. You know, go back a little bit to boundaries and borders. You know, have some control of that, but have a thriving economic community. But then, you know, you suggested, and I think, you know, there is a lot to be said for this kind of perspective. Or no, it wasn't you, actually. It was the third person in the car. Suggested, there's a wonderful expression. Well, how about they probably will just try to muddle through. And I think that was one of your alternatives as well. You know, that we may not have the political will in Europe to actually make the big decision about either going forward or going backward. So, you know, we would just sort of muddle through or try to muddle through. I'm afraid I was kind of convinced by that argument in the end, although I don't find it intellectually very attractive.
So what about muddling through?
I think muddling through is what's likely to happen. I don't think there's an appetite for big dramatic initiatives at the moment. On the other hand, there are some dynamics within the European Union, like the extension of the euro, which will gradually reduce some of the differences between member states. And I think one thing the migration issue has raised is the problems caused by economic imbalances between states. And obviously the more the integration process goes, the more important it's going to be to resolve those sorts of issues. But yes, I think muddling through along something like the present system, but hopefully giving it a bit more life than it's had in the past.
Yeah, I basically agree with this muddling through metaphor. What the big controversy is that we see from the Brexit that there is no really, I mean, there is no way out of the European Union and the integration, the level of integration that we've already achieved. I mean, we don't even know 1 year into Brexit what will happen. The government, the British government, comes up every day with a different proposal. This is ridiculous. I mean, this is a joke. No one has a clue what it was about, how to head out of it, what will happen with, I mean, so there is no way back. But I'm also very skeptical about the space further integration can take. I'm very skeptical about even the euro. I would say that eventually the euro very much strengthened the cleavages and inequality within the European Union rather than weakened them. So I don't think that many countries on the peripheries who don't yet have the euro will be willing to introduce it, and for good reasons. Think about Germany and Italy. I mean, one of the biggest cleavages in Europe is now between the Nordic states and the southern states, and the problem is that the southern states have the same currency than the Nordic states. So I think we have to be realistic and realize that there is a limit to fast integration, and you know, otherwise we're risking of, you know, falling apart of the European Union.
Yeah, there should be a very big will to take one or another scenario, yes, and we have lack of this will in European Union, as far as I understand from these reflections. And we have time for one short last question. We have two hands, and I can't. Oh, okay, so you are more persistent than your colleague.
Thank you. So I have a question which is a bit different, and it directs the discussion to a bit different way. But I think that there is a shared assumption that we have either a nation state and then or something higher, something like supranational institution. But what about other possible scenario that we have other types of formation? So and I mean not empire, not a federation, but maybe a corporation of cities. And I'm trying to suggest the idea that maybe we will have a system which would be based on city-states. Like, think about the fact that majority of the population in the planet will soon live in cities. Cities are the most dynamic places in countries. The capital, the innovations are taking place and happening in cities. And also, even in Lithuania, we talk about the capital, like the Vilnius, and the rest of the country. So what about this possible direction? And is it a possible direction? How possible it is? Thank you.
Okay, very interesting. So, Vilnius and London, like...
Yes, I mean, that in a sense is the European integration offer of multi-level governance in which power moves from the national state upwards to the union and downwards to regions, which might be cities, and you know, the whole principle of solidarity, again, one of these tiresome slogans, was that decisions should be taken at the level at which it's most appropriate. So there are things which are appropriately decided at the level of cities. And even the UK, which is terribly centralized in its political administration, is increasingly seeing and giving powers to city mayors, who are becoming much more significant figures. So I think that's also a possibility, that cities, rural areas, and other components of states may be given a larger part.
We should build the walls around the states, not allow people from rural areas to come, yes? And
well, I mean, I think in some ways something is happening which is not exactly that, but it's related to it, which is the rise of what we call gated communities, right? There's a lot of criticism, some of it valid, of the nation state as being a form of exclusionary project, you know, sort of the walled welfare state, right? And I like to remind people that the alternative we really have in front of us may well be a kind of demise, right, of the nation state and the rise of other forms, right, of community. You know, now cities might be one, walled cities, right? The other one are literally gated communities, right? That are already appearing all over the world, in fact. You know, you even see them in Nordic countries, right? People who are relatively privileged, who can buy their way out, right, of insecurity, private solutions, right, to the problems of health insurance, pensions, security, right? You know, you have the rise of private police forces. I mean, all of these things are occurring, right? So I totally agree with you that big choice is not just simply, right, between the nation state and some global world government. A far more likely scenario is that it will all sort of kind of fall apart, you know, into a, you know, kind of almost a pre-modern type of, you know, multiplicity of smaller forms, right, of community, security, and so forth and so on. You know, so I think your question is very well taken. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I think that there were much more questions raised than answers given, and we stated that the situation is unclear, and no one of our panel discutants, no one had any answer, any very clear answer about the future. So thank you very much, and thank you the audience.